Hello and welcome, everyone. It is absolutely wonderful to have you all today. We are just attending to a small technical challenge before we begin and waiting for a couple of others to join. So in the meantime, we have popped a polling question in the chat, which is whether you, before today, have heard of animal law as a field of law. So please pop your answers in the chat in the meantime, and we'll be starting very shortly. Thank you. Hi, everyone, and welcome. We are ready to begin. I'd like to ask everyone who is not speaking to please remember to mute their microphones so that we don't have any additional background noise. But thank you so much to everyone for joining today. This is Animal Law Reform South Africa's first PILG event, and we are absolutely thrilled to be here to contribute to the incredible conversations that have been taking place among social justice organizations in South Africa about the effects the COVID-19 pandemic has had on social justice and on the social justice field here in our country. I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Lara Wallace, and I am the newly appointed Executive Director of Animal Law Reform South Africa. For those of you who haven't heard of Animal Law Reform South Africa, we are a South African social justice organization with a central focus on animal law. We are the first organization of this kind, and we are a fairly young organization, having been founded in 2017 by a group of fabulous constitutional law, human rights, and animal law experts, namely Professors David Bilchitz and Bonnie Meyersfeld and Amy P. Wilson. I believe that David and possibly Bonnie are here with us today, so they might give us a wave. And the central mission of ALRSA is to work towards social justice through fostering the legal recognition of the interconnectedness between humans, animals, and our environment. And that is precisely what today's panel discussion is about. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated the detrimental effects of shifting away from more traditional African approaches to our relationship with our natural world, and of focusing purely on profit and increased industrialization over approaching development in an intersectional manner that recognizes the inextricable human, animal, and environment connection. The pandemic has also highlighted the fault lines in our society, which have manifested in the fact that in a time of crisis like the one we're experiencing now, it is society's most vulnerable members who feel the effect of the crisis most strongly. And existing inequalities are simply entrenched. Yet, as stated in the beautiful quote by Arundhati Roy that has been emphasized throughout this PILG conference, this pandemic can be a portal to another world, and it can be an opportunity to reimagine our world and our South African society. And a key part of that reimagining involves considering how our country and our laws and policies can move forward from the COVID-19 pandemic in a more sustainable way with better social justice outcomes for all. And in today's discussion, we'll be emphasizing the different contexts and different ways in which advocating for a more robust animal law protection framework in South Africa can serve to manifest on a practical level in a multitude of social justice outcomes, such as improved health, food security, more effective climate change mitigation, a healthy environment, and better sustainable development outcomes. And sorry, please could you mute your microphone? Sorry, we seem to have a non-muted microphone there, so I'll continue. So when it comes to the notion of animal law in South Africa, I see that a couple of people have mentioned in the chat that some have said that they haven't heard of it at all. Others have said that they've more thought of it when it comes to wildlife and wildlife as opposed to domestic or agriculturally used animals, while others have said that they have heard of the field. So I'll start briefly by introducing animal law as a concept. So animal law is a broad concept, and it it both entails recognizing the intrinsic worth and the value of animals as individual beings, as well as recognizing the human interest and human relationship with animals, and how humans and animals interact more broadly, and the manners in which our laws can recognize this. And when it comes to the South African legal animal law framework, as is the case with many key social justice and rights-based issues, our courts are well ahead of our current legislative framework when it comes to an understanding of and a recognition of animals and their well-being in our law. And in a seminal judgment in 2016, in the case of NSPCA versus the Minister of Justice, our Constitutional Court explicitly recognized the interconnection between environmental protection and animal welfare, and recognized these issues as intertwined. Not only did a unanimous court make that recognition, but they also recognized that respect and recognition of animal welfare goes beyond a broad moral and moral duty on people, but it goes to the need to recognize the intrinsic worth of animals as individuals. And that approach to the right to environment in Section 24 has come to be known as the integrated approach, which is a term that was coined by one of ALRSA's co-founders, David Bilgins. So our Constitutional Court has already clarified and made this connection between the human right to a healthy environment and animal welfare. And as mentioned, it is essential for our laws and policies more broadly to recognize this interconnectedness, and recognizing this interconnectedness and fostering a more robust animal law ecosystem in South Africa has the potential to lead to better social justice outcomes for all. And today, our panelists will be speaking to 3 different areas which have the potential to have this mutually reinforcing impact that will lead to better outcomes for South Africa as a whole, through the recognition of animal well-being alongside our environmental considerations and our human rights considerations, where they should all be considered collectively. So the 3 areas to which our panelists will broadly be speaking will be agriculture and food security, climate change, and wildlife trade and pandemics. And I'm now very excited to introduce you to our fabulous panelists, who will all be speaking with us today. So our first panelist, to whom I'll introduce you, is Dr. Melanie Murcott. Dr. Murcott is an attorney and a senior lecturer in the Department of Public Law at the University of Pretoria. And her incredibly lucky students are fortunate to have her as a lecturer in administrative law and environmental law. As is the case with all of our panelists today, to discuss Melanie's entire bio would take up an entire panel in itself. So I'll only draw on some brief elements of her incredible experience, and I encourage you to read up on her full bio, which is very inspiring. But in addition to teaching administrative and environmental law, Dr. Murcott is an admitted attorney, and she completed a doctoral thesis which developed a legal theory of transformative environmental constitutionalism in South Africa. And this somewhat groundbreaking theory has been playing out in our courts, and that's part of what Dr. Murcott will speak to in her presentation today. Dr. Murcott is also an executive committee member of the Environmental Law Association of South Africa. Our second speaker is Tozi Zokufa. Tozy is the executive director of the Coalition for African Animal Welfare Organizations. He is a recognized animal welfare consultant with decades of experience at a national, regional, and international level, mainly in the field of farm animals. Tozy is also a member of the African Union's Animal Platform for the Platform for Animal Welfare, and he's served on the coordination committee for the implementation of the African Union Africa Strategy for Animal Welfare. And Tozy has had extensive organizational involvement, both internationally and in South Africa, with organizations including Compassionate World Farming, Humane Society International, the Humane Education Trust, and the African Animal Welfare Alliance, among numerous others. In addition to being the executive director of Coalition for African Animal Welfare Organization, he's also the director for Soil for Life, for A Greener World, and an ambassador for World Animal Day. Our third wonderful speaker will be Kirsten Ewens. Kirsten is a qualified attorney with a master's degree in environmental law. She has specialized in her career extensively in environmental law in a range of contexts, and she has worked. She's worked especially in working to correct imbalances in power in a number of different contexts, and that includes in defending mining affected communities, as well as in advocating better protection for wildlife and endangered and threatened species. And Kirsten has done absolutely phenomenal work. And as the executive director of All Rise Attorneys for Climate and Environmental Justice, she's paving the way for even more incredible work. And I really encourage you to check out All Rise's amazing work. So without further ado, I will move to begin our discussion with our wonderful panelists. And we're going to start by asking each panelist, given their broad backgrounds, which you've just heard, where their interest in animal well-being and animal law first began. So we'll start with Tozy. I'm not sure if Tozy is.
Hi, Lara. Can you hear me now?
There we go. Thank you, Tozy. Please go ahead.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Morning from a beautiful and bit cold Cape Town for the 14th of October, but it's a beautiful day. And I was having some trouble with my microphone, Lara. I'm not sure. Maybe it's a technical glitch from my end. So I've got my PC as my screen, and I have my phone as my microphone. I hope it doesn't mess up the technicalities of the software itself. But yeah. I don't want to make it a long one, Lara and the colleagues, but it all started in 2001, and I was then at the Port Elizabeth Technicon. So that sort of gives away my age here, if I talk of Technicons, and for some reason, I was mastering the course that was named Food Hygiene and Meat Safety, and of course, when a certain company approached our lecturer to say, "Look, we have a sick individual somewhere in Oudtshoorn. Do you have a student here who can come and assist us in inspecting some ostriches in Klein Karoo Koperasi in Oudtshoorn?" And the lecturer sort of took me aside and asked if I'll be interested to go to Oudtshoorn for about 2 weeks. And I said, why not? I mean, it will be an experience for me. I'll be out of town and I'll get paid. So yeah, definitely, I'll take that challenge. Needless to say that it's been now 20-something odd years that I'm in the Western Cape. I never went back to Port Elizabeth, and found myself working for International Meat Quality Assurance, and then Provincial Department of Agriculture and the National Department of Agriculture at an abattoir level. And so it means that I was seeing these animals slaughtered on a daily basis. And yeah, that's how it started. That's more maybe a sad side of things, but then a good side of things is that after 10 years of doing that, I've met a wonderful lady by the name of Louise van der Merwe. Wanted to know more about what is happening at abattoirs, slaughterhouses, how are animals kept, and this, and yeah, she was working for a welfare organization called Compassion and World Farming at the time, and publishing a magazine called Animal Voice. And voila, as fate will have it, I ended up working with her. So here I am now, 11 or so, 12 years down the line.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tozy. We're really thrilled to have you here, and we're really looking forward to hearing your insights on agriculture and agriculture, farming, and food security, and the animal welfare and human interest in that process. So thank you. Next, we'll move to Dr. Melanie Murcott to give us a bit of insight into how she developed an interest in the animal welfare field.
Thanks, Laura, and it's wonderful to be here. I think for me, my interest in animals as an aspect or as a component of the environment was sparked by reading Jacqueline Cox's book, The War Against Ourselves. And in that book, Jacqueline speaks to how our relationships with nature are hidden from us, many of them. So how we're currently all drawing on electricity to be in this Zoom, but that electricity comes to us through copper wires underground and through coal extracted from the earth and through coal burnt into the sky. And when we think about those connections more, and we think about where does our food come from, and how does our existence affect the world in a broader sense, then we have to start thinking about how nature isn't something disconnected from us, far away. It's in our daily lives and in our existence all the time. And Wangari Maathai also speaks about it very beautifully when she says that, you know, the food we eat and the air we breathe, all of it comes from the environment. And if we're concerned about environmental protection, we should be concerned about animals. But it really hit home for me, and I started to study it a lot more and in more depth during last year in the COVID pandemic, when I started to appreciate that most human illnesses currently are zoonotic. They come from human-animal transfer, or rather animal to human transfer, and so Ebola and HIV and a host of other diseases. The majority of diseases that we experience today come from breaking down nature and getting too close to animals as a result. And of course, there's a debate about whether COVID is such a disease, but regardless of whether it comes from us breaking down nature or just interfering with it too much, that the idea of COVID also inspired me to look more into how are animals protected outside of just biodiversity, but also in our daily interactions with them, and to explore that topic a bit more.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Melanie. And we're really excited to hear you expand on that in your presentation shortly. Kirsten, I'll now hand over to you to speak about your passion and interest in animal law and animal welfare issues.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you for having me at this very exciting event. It's so good that we have this forum on the PILG agenda for this year, and hopefully it'll stay on the agenda and maybe end up in COP27 or whatever we get animal rights out there. My animal rights activism started a very long time ago. In fact, when I was 6 years old, and my mother took me to the circus, like all parents did back then, and I was totally horrified at what I saw and said, I'm not staying here, and demanded to be taken home and never ever walked into another circus again. And then when I remember very clearly this, when I was 9 years old, we went on holiday for Christmas somewhere, I think near Neisner. And there was for the Christmas meal, there was a pig on the table with an apple in its mouth, and people were carving their meat off the pig. And for the first time as a 9-year-old child, I put what was on my plate together with the animal. And much to my mother's horror, I immediately stopped eating meat on any animals from that day onwards. So she used to have to make me a separate meal, which was just vegetables for the family. So it started a very long time ago. And back then, being a vegetarian wasn't very easy. I'm sure, I don't know, I'm sure there's plenty of vegetarians on this particular discussion today, but I used to laugh because now there's such variety. My children are vegetarian now, and they don't realize what we used to go through with. There was only a vegetable platter that you could eat in a restaurant, right? You know, with your butternuts, your spinach, and lots of cheese sauce and a big mushroom. But from there, I went to university and I studied law with a focus with my majors in law and psychology, with a view to becoming a behavioral psychologist, so working with animal behavior. And then when I finished my undergrad degree, I decided to do law instead of psychology, and have only practiced in environmental law and specialized in did my environmental law master's with my master's thesis on the legal standing, the moral and legal standing of animals in South African law. So. And I'm just thrilled that with the work that I do, I'm able to keep working in animal rights and animal well-being for my clients and for activism. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kirsten, Tozy, and Melanie. And once again, we're thrilled to have you here. And you all bring such a rich background to the subject of the essential value of recognizing our interconnectedness as humans with animals and our natural world. So at this point, we will move to an exploration by each of the panelists on the different specific areas that we have mentioned. Each of the panelists will speak for between 10 and 15 minutes, and please feel free. We want this to be an interactive discussion, and we're excited to have a Q&A debate afterwards. So please, as the speakers are speaking, if you'd like to raise a question, either for any of the speakers or perhaps for Animal Law Reform South Africa, then please pop it in the chat. If it can't be addressed immediately during this discussion because of time limitations, then we will be sure to consider it further in our research as Animal Law Reform SA. So I will now hand over to Tozy, who will be speaking to us about an exploration of animal well-being and social justice in the context of food security and agriculture. Tozy, please go ahead.
Thank you, Lara. I thought maybe it should be ladies first, kind of kind of a scenario, but I guess I'm in the room with the lawyers here, so there's no such a thing as ladies first. Yeah, well, mine is a I think it should be a straightforward one, because these are issues that we all know, we all deal with, but the focus would really be on I'll talk about the impact of animal or industrial animal agriculture, on the environment, maybe a little bit on our health as well. It's a bit of a controversial sort of I don't want to say topic, maybe engagement, and I'm sure my colleagues Melanie and especially Kirsten will definitely know about being judged when you say you don't eat certain foods, and for food systems themselves are complex, and I mean the way we we distribute them, the way we process them, the way we grow them, the way we consume them. It's a complex system that needs a holistic approach if you are to win in whatever recommendations that you come up with. And there's a lot of different stakeholders that come on board, and hence it will take probably years to reach a consensus, especially from the United Nations point of view. But for a green recovery to happen for our own country, in fact, maybe for the continent, it's so unfortunate that the African continent, lags behind when it comes to industrial animal agriculture, but they are really getting a beating when it comes to the impact of industrial animal agriculture in terms of the health, climate change, and all of that. And really, we're not playing a ball, but there are countries that are consuming, for example, a lot of meat. If we look at United States, consuming roughly 126, 127 kilograms of meat per person per year. But then you look at the tiny nation of Lesotho, Swaziland, Eswatini, and they consume 10, 11 kilograms per person per year. And then, but still, when it comes to the impact of industrial animal agriculture, we get a hiding, but we are not necessarily participating in this, big cruel game. So it is then that if we are to have a green recovery for the country, we have to look at the food systems that we employ. And because food systems are at the center of the challenges that we are currently facing today, whether it's COVID-19, yes, it was mentioned that it's not clear as yet if really COVID is coming from an animal, but we know that there are those talks. And as well, if you look at climate change, other challenge that we are facing, definitely industrial animal agriculture is playing a role there. And if we are indeed to build back better, we have to look at maybe our food systems. And then, of course, now COVID-19 with all its lockdowns, level 1 to 0, level 5, and so on, it gives us that chance to refresh, to restart, and to reconsider how we produce our food. I mean, this all started, of course, in the 1950s. Especially with regards to animal agriculture. Now, I mean, when the concentration of animals in one place, it really took off in the 1950s. Others are arguing, of course, it took off after the World War II, when had to be mass production of food. And of course, the population since then has grown 200% to what we are experiencing today. Fossil fuel consumption is over now 500%. Also, marine fish capturing is over 300%. Of course, now if we believe in karma, we are to face the music one way or another. How we treat Mother Earth, or how we treat the environment, it has to come back to haunt us. And it's haunting us in terms of storms, hurricanes, tsunamis, and drought, and all of those. And really, I think the environment is saying, hey, you guys get your act together, because we are interconnected here. Don't do your own thing for selfish reasons. Let's balance. And if we are to balance, and then the system will work itself out. As recently as 2016, planet Earth experienced the warmest year ever, in the history of taking temperatures. And as recently as well as 2018, we were experiencing the warmest oceans for the first time, also acidic as well. So definitely there are some hints that the environment is giving us that what we are doing, the trajectory that we're finding ourselves in, is really not working. And we need to go back to the drawing board and see what we can do for future generations. And of course, without taking too much time, there's this issue of 150 species approximately being extinct on a daily basis. Now, if 150 sounds little, try saying 55,000 a year, or 110,000 species going extinct every 2 years. I mean, that's a huge number. And of course, industrial animal agriculture comes with it. There's air pollution, whether it's methane, there's water pollution, whether it's nitrogen-based fertilizers or it's animal waste creeping into our rivers. There's deforestation. We can talk about the Amazon and how many thousands of square kilometers are getting cleared to plant feed for animals. Of course, our food is becoming less and less nutritious as well because of what is happening. So I think Section 24 of our Constitution, 108 of 1996, is now offering us an opportunity to look into, especially now after COVID, to look into how do we design the food systems that will be in balance with the environment, with our well-being, with animal well-being as well. And some of us here, especially the environmental lawyers, will definitely be aware of environmental impact assessments. You know, when there's a building coming up, a shopping mall, a mine, there will be this process of environmental impact assessment. And there's a new one that I think we're celebrating its 6-year anniversary now, the socio-economic impact assessment system that was introduced by the government. They started talking about it in 2007, but it really took effect from the Department of Monitoring and Planning, I think, DME. And they started introducing it in 2015 in October, and it's something that is being used. It's a system that is being used until this date, and it will be used into the future. So you have these assessments that do take place. There's also a health impact assessment, looking at maybe the evidence-based policy when you're wanting to improve health. You're looking at behavior and lifestyles. You look at biological factors. And all of these impact assessments, of course, they're there to predict the consequences and also provide information to help prioritize some prevention strategies and also control strategies. My take now with all of these assessments is that why don't we have something called a well-being impact assessment, where you look at maybe the well-being of both the population, meaning the people, and also the animal. So every time there's going to be a farm that is coming up or some sort of, let's call it a farm or industrial farm or effective farm, then we do an impact assessment on the well-being of the people who are working there or who are to work there, and also the animals that will be based in that facility. And with those opening remarks, Lara and the colleagues, I think that it's about time when we then go back to the drawing board, when we say we want to build back better, to look at our food systems and the impact that they have on the environment. And then, of course, as a country, as a continent, which will eventually experience a double population and number, meaning that 100%, population growth by 2050. If currently we are 1 billion now on the African continent, we'll be around close to 2 billion in 2050. And of course, there needs to be food for that population. And if we don't take a look at our food systems today, I think it will be too late by then to want to go back to the drawing board. With those few words, then I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tozi, for such a rich presentation. And you've drawn on so many key elements. And I really love your suggestion on the notion of a well-being impact assessment. In addition to, it was recently that climate impact assessments were recognized as being essential. So there's definitely room to expand our impact assessment models to result in better outcomes for communities, people, and planet. And I also appreciated your reference to the impacts of industrial farming in terms of water pollution and others, which as we've mentioned, it's largely communities living in poverty that bear the brunt of those impacts. So again, we are only serving to exacerbate inequality, and these are issues we really need to address. And it's really wonderful that you mentioned. It's really wonderful that you mentioned the climate change issues attached to industrial farming as well. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Melanie, who is going to be exploring animal well-being, climate and environment through a social justice lens. So please go ahead, Melanie.
Great, thanks. I apologize. I think I need to switch screens. One moment. All right, you should be able to see just the presentation. Great. So hopefully, building on what Tozy has said, I want to speak a little bit about the connection between climate change, animal well-being, and justice. And I think it's useful to start by thinking about some sort of premises or core ideas that promote intersectional thinking in this context. And the first is that climate change and the global climate crisis are human-induced. So we are the cause of climate change and the global climate crisis that we currently face, human behavior. Of course, different humans are responsible to different degrees, and the global north, humans in the global north bear primary responsibility over the course of history. But it's important to first recognize that there's a connection between human behavior and climate change. The second core idea that we should grapple with in intersectional thinking is that humans have become a geological force or a force of nature through our consumption and commodification of the environment, including animals. And of course, this idea ties up with economic systems that dominate much of our world, not all of it, but much of it, particularly neoliberal capitalism. And this idea that humans have become a geological force is recognized by geologists who propose that we're in this era of the Anthropocene, a time where human beings equate to the comets that crashed into Earth and killed the dinosaurs thousands of years ago. And then the third core idea that we need to reflect on is that human flourishing and the attainment of social justice, as well as the fulfillment of human rights, can't be achieved without a well-functioning environment. So we need to then think about how we are the cause of our crisis, but we also need to protect the environment in order to solve that crisis. And then reflect on how animals form part of the environment in doing so, and reflect on our relationships with animals. So the last idea that helps us to engage in joined up or intersectional thinking for purposes of this presentation is that advancing animal well-being is one way to promote a well-functioning environment, which then can in turn promote human flourishing and the attainment of social justice, as well as all other human rights. So we're not protecting animals out of a purely utilitarian perspective, and we're not thinking about advancing animal well-being purely out of an ecocentric perspective. We're trying to engage in joined up or intersectional thinking that sees human and animal interests and the interests of the environment more broadly as mutually reinforcing of one another. And it's that idea that humans and animals exist within a single, and the environment more broadly exists within a single socio-ecological system that informed a legal theory of transformative environmental constitutionalism. The idea that broader societal transformation grounded in the Constitution can't occur unless we protect the environment, animals being a core part of the environment. And so hopefully these core premises set the scene for the rest of the presentation and for the idea a green recovery amidst COVID-19. It's also worth pointing out that the idea of a single socio-ecological system in which humans and the environment are interconnected, and this idea of intersectional thinking is not something new. It's very much a long-standing idea that's bound up in the idea of relatedness that underpins Ubuntu. And so the idea that an obsession with animal well-being is a Western obsession can be broken down or deconstructed when we think about relatedness as being a core tenet of Ubuntu. So then let's also just go to the ideas of social, environmental, and climate justice, which I think all of us at PILG are concerned about as public interest lawyers. And this idea is really grounded on the idea, or at least on the understanding of social justice, that it's concerned with addressing unjust distribution of goods and bads amongst people, and the underlying causes of that unjust distribution, including exclusion from decision making and so on, a lack of recognition of people's moral worth. It links to environmental justice because environmental justice is about advancing the just distribution of environmental benefits and burdens. So part of the goods that should be fairly distributed amongst people, and recognizing poor and vulnerable people suffer disproportionately from harmful environmental practices. And in turn, emerging from the idea of environmental justice is the idea of climate justice, that one aspect of harm to the environment is climate change, and that there's an unjust distribution of climate change vulnerabilities and impacts, as well as unjust causes or distribution of causes of climate change, and that there's a lack of recognition and exclusion of people from participation in decision-making about these impacts and in the responses to these impacts. Climate justice reminds us that the current global climate crisis raises not only technical or scientific issues, but also ethical and political issues related to the distribution of climate change impacts and its causes. And climate change is also, in this light, being referred to as a form of slow violence against poor and vulnerable people, as global temperature increases cause impacts on a global scale, extending in time far beyond the actual emission of a greenhouse gas, and impact poor and vulnerable people in particular, such that deep inequalities within countries are exacerbated. And the poor, who are already socially, economically, or environmentally vulnerable, are likely to feel the impacts of climate change most severely. And part of this presentation and this panel, I think, is about recognizing that the mistreatment of animals, including through mass meat production and industrial scale fishing, as well as our agricultural practices more broadly, contributes to climate change to a significant degree. And then in turn, this mistreatment of animals gives rise to climate, environmental, and social injustice as interconnected ideas. So if we're advancing a truly sustainable society, we need to think about how social needs and welfare and economic opportunity are integrally related to environmental limits, including the limits that animals have and their interests. And those limits are imposed by supporting ecosystems. So ecosystems create the conditions in which social justice can occur. So then I wanted to draw your attention to the Climate Justice Charter, which recognizes a lot of what I've been saying and also really reflects a good, or rather aligns with what I've been saying and advances intersectional thinking. The Climate Justice Charter emerges out of a 6-year campaign during the worst drought in South Africa's history by the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign and the Cooperative and Policy Alternative Center. And it's involved a large number of stakeholders, faith-based communities, youth, climate scientists, academics, women's organizations, environmental and social justice organizations. And if we're not already doing this as public interest lawyers, we need to start drawing on this document a lot and showing why it's important in public interest litigation and advancing public interests more generally and human rights fulfillment. So one of the core principles of the Climate Justice Charter that's worth reflecting on is the idea that we need to reconnect with an earth-centered conception of what it means to be human. Nature, it says, is endless, and we are just one small part of it. We have to appreciate that every element of the ecosystem has an intrinsic value and must be respected. And certainly this idea of our relationship with nature aligns with Ubuntu, which is for me an undercurrent of the Climate Justice Charter, as Ubuntu reminds us of our relatedness with one another, our ancestors, and the broader Earth system of which we're a part. And so that's one of the core principles of the Climate Justice Charter. There are also a number of principles for deep, just transitions, which include ecocentric living, and importantly, decoloniality as one of the solutions to climate change and one of the ways in which we can advance climate justice. So we need to de-link from the system that advances extractivism, violence, including towards animals, and domination. And we need to affirm an emancipatory relationship between humans and non-human nature, rooted in our history, culture, knowledge, and the wider struggle of the oppressed on planet Earth. And I think that's a really useful way of thinking about a response to climate change and a response to the challenges that Tozy mentioned in his presentation. And then lastly, the Climate Justice Charter, it's a brilliant document with a lot of other brilliant things in it, but for purposes of thinking about animal well-being, it speaks to a systemic alternative for transformative change, which includes rights of nature and natural climate solutions. And it speaks to community-led initiatives being crucial, and solutions like restoration, land management activities that increase carbon storage, grasslands and advanced agroecological farmlands. So all of that responses to and a rejection of the idea of factory farming, industrialized scale fishing, and moving in a way that is decolonial and more centered around our relationships with nature. So very briefly then, let's look at whether the NDC, which is South Africa's commitment to contributing to staying within the Paris Agreement's global temperature goal that will prevent catastrophic climate change implications for the world. And whether this document aligns with intersectional thinking and recognizes the challenges that animals, or a rejection of animal well-being puts on our country and contributes towards greenhouse gas emissions. So the document, and many of you will be familiar with it as one of our core policy responses to climate change in the country. It focuses primarily on the electricity sector, and whilst it sets carbon budgets, it's not clear how much of that carbon budget is linked to responding to harmful animal agriculture and fishing practices. And why should it be? Well, the agricultural sector utilizes the majority of ice-free land in the world. It's the largest consumer of fresh water and has a substantial impact on biodiversity. It also produces large amounts of greenhouse gases through rumination, deforestation, desertification, and these problems are just going to get worse over the next few years. And they've been recognized by the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, and Tozy's spoken to them as well. But we currently have unabated meat consumption and production. And if this continues, then 37 to 49 of the world's global greenhouse gas budget to keep us within the 2-degree temperature rise will be used up by 2030. And so it's a real problem that our mitigation targets don't explicitly engage with animal agriculture and with industrial scale fishing. And this is particularly so because there's quite a lot of research that South Africa is one of the biggest consumers of meat on the continent, if not the biggest consumer. And that obviously that consumption raises huge questions about our relationships with animals. Sorry, so I should have been updating that as I went. But I think all of this is unrelated to the challenge that animals and fish are sentient beings, which our courts have recognized and which the NDC fails to engage with in any meaning or at all. We can just say at all, because that's the truth. And so to conclude, given the climate change implications of agriculture and aquaculture, we really need an NDC in response to climate change that's more responsive to animal well-being in the context of the agriculture and aquaculture sector, because these are social justice, environmental, and climate justice issues that are fundamentally connected to the fulfillment of human rights. And we can look to the Climate Justice Charter, which sets our broad policy goals for systemic alternatives, and that could help us with new ways of thinking about animal well-being, social justice, and a healthy environment. Thanks, and sorry for being so long.
That was absolutely wonderful, Melanie. Thank you, and you were right. You were right on time. And thank you so much. Again, you've raised so many fascinating issues for exploration and so many key interlinked themes. And I think there's so much value in the point that you've raised about how taking a decolonized approach when thinking about our climate change and environmental protection more broadly is going to be really central to our strategy going forward and to ensure a more interconnected approach. And that speaks to the need to ensure that we are consulting with a wide and diverse spectrum of South Africa when government is determining policies, and these opportunities to contribute to these policies need to be made for communities, particularly communities living in rural areas who are most ultimately most affected by these policies, yet often have limited say. So thank you. So I will now hand over to Kirsten, who will again be speaking to, I think climate change is a thread that's going to go all the way through here. And Kirsten will be focusing on wildlife trade and habitat preservation and the need for an intersectional approach in that realm. Thank you, Kirsten. Go ahead.
Well, thank you. I think more than anything, my thread is probably a moral thread based on my history of how I got involved in animal rights. And as I said before, I finalized my master's thesis in 2003, and that was on animal rights, a moral and legal discussion on the standing of animals in South African law. And even then, it was a sad indication of where animals stood in society, legally defined as property. There was a poor legislative framework for their protection, and generally animals were to be used at whim by humankind. 2003 was a long time ago, and unfortunately we have not made much progress since then. I proposed then, as I do now, that law and morality are of necessity connected. Law often affects public morality, albeit forcefully, in trying to get people not to drive drunk, for example. There are fines for that. And often public morality determines laws. Constitutional law, at least, cannot logically be separated from moral philosophy. And as animals are beings of moral concern, they should be considered as recipients of legal rights. And I mean, David Bilschitz will have, he's got wonderful writings on this from 2010 and 2012 on animal rights and the interpretation of South Africa's constitution. But I think that we can all agree that human rights, animal rights, and environmental rights are linked. And where one suffers, we all do. Nothing has made that clearer than the dramatic arrival of COVID-19 as a major global pandemic. And I would like to think that we have all read something in the last 18 months that discusses how the emergence of pandemics is caused by human activities, as Melanie said, and the impacts of these activities on the environment. In my mind, it has always been very clear that we need to stop the unsustainable exploitation of the environment. But for me, this was a moral obligation, not necessarily to prevent future pandemics. In fact, pandemics didn't even come into my thought processes. But as we have seen, they go hand in hand. And because of COVID-19, it is very clear that environmental exploitation is a global health and social justice issue. So let me explain in my little science that I know, understand about how these pandemics work. A series of scientific papers that I've been following over the last 18 months suggest that the same environmental changes that threaten biodiversity loss on a global scale. So that would be things like land use change, climate change. Of interest for me in this particular session is the unsustainable trade and consumption of wildlife, agriculture intensification, which Tozy spoke about, globalized trade and travel. Those things are also driving the increasing spread of novel viral diseases like COVID-19. And how I understand it is that pandemics are a subset of emerging infectious diseases that tend to originate first in rural regions of tropical or subtropical countries with high wildlife diversity, because then they also have a high viral diversity. Also where human populations are growing rapidly, and where land use change is driving closer contact amongst people and wildlife. So rural communities in developing countries are often on the front line of disease emergence, just as they're on the front line of climate impact. For me, a surprising statistic is that 70% of emerging diseases like Ebola or Zika and almost all known pandemics, influenza, HIV/AIDS, COVID-19, are zoonoses, which are caused by microbes of animal origin. And then what happens is these microbes spill over due to contact amongst wildlife, livestock, and people. What is even more shocking is that the international legal wildlife trade has increased 500% in value since 2005 and 2,000% since the 1980s. This information, case study data, and analysis of trends suggests that the legal wildlife trade is unsustainable and will be a continuing and very great threat to biodiversity conservation. So with the globalization of trade routes, the lack of sufficient reporting, the links between poverty and illegal hunting, and insufficient regulation throughout many trade pathways, there's the suggestion that the wildlife trade will become more unsustainable in the future. The USA is one of the largest legal importers of wildlife globally, with 10 to 20 million individual wild animals imported each year, largely for the pet trade. Isn't that crazy? The number of shipments rose from 7,000 to 13,000 per month from 2000 to 2015. Over and above that, we've got the hunting, trading, butchering, and preparation of wildlife for consumption, which has led to significant proportion of known zoonoses, emerging infectious diseases, and pandemics. Bringing it to home, the legal wildlife trade of South Africa is governed essentially by our National Environmental Management Biodiversity Act, where it specifically gives effect to South Africa's obligations under international agreements regulating international trade in specimens of endangered species, in other words, CITES. For those of you who don't know CITES, it's the Convention of International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, and has been around since 1975. Our Biodiversity Act also ensures that certain restricted activities are in place involving specimens of listed, threatened, or protected species, which can't take place without a permit being issued. So they can take place provided a permit is issued. However, there is a very big illegal wildlife trade. It's real. It's an ongoing crisis of huge proportion operated by very high-level criminal syndicates around the world. And wildlife crime negatively impacts on South Africa's international image and reputation, undermines economic development, and poses a threat to national security. But what it does also do, it creates a presence of international organized crime syndicates in the country and is of very serious conservation, ecological, and biological global significance. It always was. And now with pandemics in the mix, it's even more so. Also in South Africa, there's commercial exploitation of wild animals, including wildlife ranching, exotic breeding, game translocations, game auctions, carnivore and predator breeding for hunting and tourism, and animal interaction facilities, such as walking with lions, cheetahs, and other wild animals, lion cub and cheetah petting, and elephant back safaris. The trade in wildlife is a particularly important risk factor for disease emergence because it provides the intimate contact among wildlife, livestock, and humans. And this allows for the spillover of pathogens and the spread of pathogens. And the increased numbers of densely farmed animals, both domestic and wild, because unfortunately we do have farmed wild animals in South Africa, allow infections to spread more easily and drive bigger outbreaks. An increased volume of trade and efficiency of the long-distance transport systems that we have now along the wildlife trade supply chain drives the movement of pathogens across large distances to contact populations that may not have had prior infection by them. Many of you may know that in May 2019, our department, the South African Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, published an amendment to the Animal Improvement Act by introducing 33 wild species, 26 which are indigenous to Africa into Table 7 of the Act. And those animals included giraffe, lion, cheetah, black and white rhino. Now, bearing in mind that the purpose of the Animal Improvement Act is to provide for the breeding, identification, and utilization of genetically superior animals, these amendments were not taken too well by the conservation community. The species concerned have the potential to be used for ecotourism, live sales, meat, milk and hide production, hunting for trophies, and in the case of white and black rhino, the harvesting of horn. And the spread of diseases between wildlife species and domestic stock is not addressed in this act. As has been made evident from the last 18 months that we've all lived through, the international community as a whole must consider prevention and control of wildlife diseases as crucial components of safeguarding global animal and public health, as well as biodiversity, while dealing with related agriculture and trade issues. So thankfully, this year, the work of the high-level panel, which was established, and this is a very long-worded panel name, to review the policies, legislation, and related practices on the management, breeding, hunting, trade, and handling of elephant, lion, leopard, and rhinoceros. So very luckily in June 21, this high-level panel put together a number of recommendations. And one of the recommendations was that there is a revision of the Animal Improvement Act and its regulations to remove these 5 iconic species, and recommended putting in place legislation that prevents the domestication and intensive and selective breeding of these iconic wildlife species. Only these species though, unfortunately. But hey, it's an improvement. The pandemic has thrown into global light our relationship with animals, human greed, and the animal ethics of live markets, animal feedlots for meat consumption, the wild animal captive breeding industry, and wildlife trade. In the last 100 years, with the human population having increased almost fourfold, and the world witnessing an unprecedented decline in natural environment, we have to focus on how we are going to prevent this exploitation from continuing. Today, the chain of rights, the rights of people, the rights of animals, and environmental rights are clearer than ever. One becomes ill, it affects us all. So preventing the next pandemic will require protecting the health of the planet and all who inhabit it. Fortunately, I'm more encouraged by our movement towards a more sustainable use, and I don't even like the word use, of our environment, with the draft policy position now having been published as a result of the High Panel report. And I think what we're going to see in the next year is quite a few policies being released for public comment based on what was put in the high-level panel report. So we are making headway, and while there are still gaps, I think we are heading in the right direction. I don't have time in these 10 minutes to go through the draft policies or the high-level panel report, but I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A. But just to say that since 2003, it's now 2021, we're making small steps, and maybe we have COVID-19 to thank for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kirsten, for a wonderful and also incredibly rich presentation. And I think it's really wonderful how the points that you've raised about you know, that linkage between our treatment of wildlife and our diminishing species, bringing us into closer contact with wildlife than ever before, placing us at more risk of future pandemics. And the way that there's been, you know, as you mentioned, through the Animal Improvement Act, which has included a whole bunch, as you mentioned, of wild animals as farmed animals under our law, is deeply concerning, and something that I think there isn't great broad public awareness, you know, of these issues, principally because you know, animal law hasn't been considered to be an issue of broad public importance, in spite of, as we've seen, the close relationship between animals and people in so many different contexts. Thank you also for providing that insight into the extent of the wildlife trade market. I think many of us and many members of the public haven't quite realized that great extent. So thank you. And I think all of you had such wonderful connecting threads on these issues. So before we move on to some of the audience questions, and I invite the audience to continue popping any other questions into the chat. I'd like to put one more question to all of our panelists, and that is, when thinking about each of the issues that you've explored and you've focused on, and when thinking about the role and place of social justice and public interest organizations and the tools available to these organizations, what and I mean, and this could be a very long answer, so I suppose you could just perhaps mention one possible step or one issue that you think could be the most important to focus on, but on a practical level, what should civil society and the broader public be focusing, whether it be through the three mechanisms that ALRSA employs, namely education and public awareness, direct lobbying for law reform, and even a public interest litigation, or through other more creative means. I would just love to hear from each of you what what steps you feel would be the most valuable. So perhaps we can start with we can go in the same order, and we'll start with Tozi once again.
Thanks, Lara. Well, that's definitely I mean, that would be at the policy level, right? And that's a question that needs to be unpacked at that level. But it's doable. It's definitely not impossible. I mean, looking at these processes of the assessments, for example, public participation, and also assessing whether how much impact will this have on the environment, on the well-being, of course, of the animal, of the people, and also the socio-economic impact of what we currently have. And there's evidence, of course. I can give one example of the fact that I personally know for sure that extensive animal agriculture is sort of time consuming, and also it's labor intensive. So I mean, we can gel that with the fact that we have a high employment rate or high unemployment rate, especially when it comes to the youth. So why aren't our government and maybe policymakers then advocating for extensive agriculture, knowing that there will be a lot of people being taken up to be employed in those systems? So I mean, it could be a win-win situation. There was mention of extractivism and also colonialism and neo-colonialism. I think the greed itself is where we are now. Certain families or certain individuals wanting to get rich all by themselves. But if we were really to look at it from the social justice angle, environmental justice angle, and also, you know, the well-being of the population and the well-being of the animals, it could be then that thousands of people might just, you know, live in an eco-sustainable manner, instead of just a few individuals living a rich life. So I'll answer it by saying that public participation and also creating of awareness and also lobbying, I think, policymakers to go for a system, from my perspective now, for a food system that doesn't have much impact on the environment, social justice, and also well-being of the population and the animals. I hope it sort of captures what I'm thinking, Lara.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Tozi. You make very valid points around the importance of lobbying actively for these policy changes, and I think it's about shifting narratives to focus more on the value of recognizing these interconnections. So thank you. We'll move to Melanie next.
Thanks, Lara. So I think a lot of what I would propose is drawn from a brilliant article by Vinari and Vinari on a just transition towards plant-based diets. And they recommend a whole range of objectives and strategies, and then tactical measures as well as operational measures that can be advanced. And I'd really encourage anyone who's thinking about this to engage with these different objectives and strategies and tactics and operational steps. So just for one example, on the objective of participation and empowerment, they say we'll need strategies around global initiatives to promote citizen participation in food production. So that would be it's nice because it's a very practical thing. We need people to be more involved in food production. And so then they say, as one of the tactics for that, we would need to acknowledge that food production and animal farming are related in school curricula and possibly in university curricula or tertiary curricula. And then they speak to, at the operational level, actually enabling by funding and subsidizing and empowering small scale vegetable farming. And so it's a sort of three-tiered thing aimed at advancing participation, acknowledging that a just transition towards less meat consumption, given its harmful nature, will require bringing people along and sort of bottom-up solutions.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that's I think what you've mentioned is really, really key in terms of that need for bottom-up solutions, and that need for as we've said, and as you've emphasized, for this broader participation in the development of these solutions. And yeah, thank you so much. These are all very, very key points that I'd love to unpack some more. However, we do only have 10 minutes left in the session, so I will move on to Kirsten now. Thank you.
Well, over and above what Melanie and Tozi have said, which I agree completely with, I think there are a lot of great organizations out there that are doing work that helps this already. And if civil society is going to work as a whole, then from a legal point of view would be to watch out for these policy documents that are being circulated for public comment and make comments on them. The recent one is on the hunting quotas. So that's stuff that individuals can do, but what civil society groups as a whole can do. But I also think it's important to say here that we must never underestimate what individuals can do. So as one person who has chosen to, well, everybody who's on this discussion today, each individual has the power to make a change just by talking to people next to them on the streets or in the airplane, or just talking about what you heard today, one person, and just sharing the information and bringing awareness, heightening the awareness, making it more real for everybody else is what I don't think that must ever be underestimated.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kirsten. That was that was incredibly insightful, and it's wonderful how you've drawn threads together here between what each of you wonderful speakers have raised. And we unfortunately only have 5 minutes left before we'll have to close up, but please know that we will we are saving the questions coming through in the chat box, and we will do our best to be able to address them at a later stage, or even through reaching out to you directly as audience members. So please continue to stay engaged, and don't hesitate to reach out to us, and I'm sure each of the panelists will be happy to address your questions externally as well. I think that one question that we could perhaps try to touch on very briefly is the question of the and I'd welcome a participation from any of the speakers on this. The question of that, which links closely to what we've already discussed, but of that need to transform public consciousness of the link between animal well-being, human rights, and sustainable environment. And I want to tie into that a very key and interesting question that has been raised by Professor Madlingozi, which is that the question of what decoloniality might actually mean in practice when we are speaking about this need to reconnect with more true African values, rather than the kind of overly industrialized profit over all else approach that our world has led us to. So I'd welcome some thoughts on this from any one of the panelists before we'll finally have to wrap up.
I'm happy to go first and get things going. I think that, so one of the ideas that decolonial thinking allows us is what I've said in the chat, is that we don't have to think in dichotomies about either being ecocentric or anthropocentric, if we can think of ourselves as in a community and a broader Earth community, and also in reflecting on relatedness and what that means for us. And I think that's one of the nice things that decolonial thinking encourages us to do, is to break down these very hard barriers that Western ways of thinking push us into. And then I've also been reading recently about how thinking about the ways in which the environment serves human interests, which is, obviously an anthropocentric way of thinking, allows us also to grapple with the ways in which we are the causes of environmental destruction. So it's not necessarily bad to grapple with the reality that we are consumers of the environment, and we are influencing. We are a geological force, and when we think about that, to recognize that, we, by imposing greater obligations on ourselves and recognizing our relatedness with the environment, we can be responsive to those impacts. So that doesn't really answer the question in great detail, but it's hopefully a start.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Melanie. As you said, I think in the time that we have, you've made a really excellent start in addressing that, and I especially appreciate your statement on how anthropocentrism is also, as you say, about recognizing and appreciate the impact that we that humans have had on our environment through embracing such an approach of inherent separateness between humans and environment, rather than appreciating the interconnection, as we've seen in many African cultures. The Constitutional Court in the NSPCA judgment explicitly referenced the ancient Khoisan reverence for wild animals in that judgment. And these are all values that we've moved away from, and specifically this move towards industrialization, and both in terms of our move towards factory farming, and the South African government's plans to actually scale up factory farming from now, and even in terms of thinking about just the way that during COVID, so many developments, mining developments and others, were sort of quietly pushed through with the excuse that there was no need to have proper consultation because it was basically too difficult to do so during COVID. So those needs were dispensed with, which has resulted in, which is going to result in more habitat destruction and more impacts that are going to continue to impact on again our most vulnerable members of society. So I thank you everyone so much for your participation here, and we are saving the questions in the chat, and we'll endeavor to engage with all of the issues that you've raised over email or in another forum. And please feel free to reach out to us. You can find our details on our website. And in the meantime, to close, I think we can all just reflect on how the COVID-19 crisis is something that has already as I've said, already exposed all of these fault lines and exposed who suffers the most when crisis hits. And if we continue on the path that we've been on, all we are doing is exacerbating existing harms, and further entrenching the extreme inequality that plagues our country, which means that when future crises come, which unfortunately they will in one form or another, we're placing ourselves in the same, or if not a worse position. So I think let's all bring our hearts, minds, legal skills, and activism together to ensure that the portal that we are taking ourselves through is one that can recognize our interconnectedness and adopt a much more sustainable approach that will mean both a more compassionate and more resilient society in the future. So thank you all, and I look forward for more engagement on these topics. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, people.
Thank you for the session.
Thank you for your participation.
Question before we leave, do we go to the main room or the entire session is completely over?
If you click on leave room, it'll take you to the main session where there'll be a break before the next sessions are due to start.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Ready. Mercy, mercy, mercy. Is a whole lot be
Okay, I completely understand. Okay, I completely understand you. What I said, like we are, like you said, we stuff, and I am going through it, but it was obviously silent, much more tension than anything else. I've been going through some of the things. I'm still gonna go through. He just told me now that they had some ESCOM problem and he wasn't connected and my emails were queued. So I'm gonna get all of that there and then take it from there. And then the one thing we like, just because we want us to be alert check thing, like obviously it's registered and all of that there, but since they want to make me like the 51% shareholder, he wants to make me the 51% shareholder, that's where the legalities of this comes in. It's you going to, I will get a contract and then you can like just go through it and take a look at the fine print, also with the agreement that we have in place. And then it's not a rush for now. For now, we're basically like just getting all of the things out of the way, like the business email addresses, the website, and so forth. And then yeah, then we're good to go.
be